When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, I want to talk about what is George R.R. Martin's best written A Song of Ice and Fire book. And you guys might be thinking, well, haven't you already done multiple videos on like ranking the books? Yes, I have. But this is the difference between those rankings and this one. You can even watch those videos before you do this one or streams or whatever. Is that this is not my personal favorite book that I'm like trying to rank here, or it's not based upon what books I like the most. I'm trying to get to the title of this is which is the most consistently and best written books that George has put out. And so to clarify what I mean by that, for that to make sense is these books cannot have many like kind of mediocre chapters or, okay parts of the books where there's like, okay, there's a really good section of the book and there's like a section of the book and then really good, like, because there's some writing flaws in there that leads to that issue. And so you guys are going to find out as we go through all of the, main A Song of Ice and Fire books that they don't really indicate which is actually my favorites, right? This list is pretty different than my actual rankings of the books. And so let's not waste a lot of time and let's get into it. But before we do, thank you to my members and Patreons for supporting me on this channel. If you didn't want to become one, you do get videos early. And you also do get an exclusive video each week. So, again, I don't think this is a huge surprise. Out of the Song of Ice and Fire books, number 8 has got to be A World of Ice and Fire. And I guess I should have clarified, I'm also talking about, like, lore books as well, or, like, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. But I think A World of Ice and Fire is fine. It's a history book, but I don't think it matches up into the other books in this series. I think Fire and Blood as a history book is better than A World of Ice and Fire. But A World of Ice and Fire, to me, it's perfectly fine. It's not a bad book or anything, but it doesn't really compare to, the other things. It's not really a fair comparison, in my opinion. So it's at number 8. Number 7, this is where I think you should, I think this is right off the bat where you should kind of realize this isn't about my favorite books. Number 7 I have is Fire and Blood. And you guys know, in past rankings, I have put Fire and Blood at like 5 before, which is one above a main series book and A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. I really like A Fire and Blood, but if I look at Fire and Blood, it is not the best written book at times, right? Like Jaehaerys's reign is not the best written at times. There's parts of this book that just, I can't compare it to other books in the main series in terms of a writing aspect, because those books have much more clearer and deeper characters and meaningful things going on. The reason I like Fire and Blood is not necessarily the writing of Fire and Blood, or I guess the actual technical objective like writing of the book, right? Like I like a lot of the concepts of the book, like introducing a unreliable narrator and having us choose what is the right option. That's not exactly to me the best writing that George has ever done, even though I do like that style. I think if I take a step back and take away my Fire and Blood bias, because I love Fire and Blood, I think objectively it's not the best written book compared to kind of the rest of the list. Number 6, I have A Dance with Dragons at number 6 because, in my opinion, this book is just super inconsistent. There are certain plot lines that I think aren't written the best, namely like the second half of Tyrion's arc. I think that, parts of Daenerys aren't particularly that interesting, and it doesn't feel the best written as it could have been condensed down. I think that A Dance with Dragons, to me, of the 5 books, of the 5 main story books, I feel like is the most inconsistently written one. And so the weird thing about A Dance with Dragons is it has really high highs, right? Like the stuff with Asha and Theon are incredible to read. Some of George's best writing. But at the same time, some of his worst writing is also in this book. And so I have to take that into account. I think if you match that up with the rest of the series, the writing is not as good as it is in other books. Number 5, I have A Feast for Crows. And I wasn't sure where I was going to land with A Feast for Crows because I think A Feast for Crows is just a book that is very similar to A Game of Thrones, except it doesn't hit, in my opinion, the heights of the writing, like of the peak of writing in the first book, and it doesn't really hit that in A Feast for Crows. And I think A Feast for Crows is really well written. And let me put this forward. I think all these books are well written. In my opinion, it's why I love this, topic. It's why I love like this book series and why I've made, over probably like 500, 600 videos on this world. I just think that A Feast for Crows has some glaring issues in it. One of those issues is Samwell is just not a very good POV in this book at all. You can almost remove his entire storyline, and it doesn't really make a difference, really. But then you have George's best writing, which is characters like Jamie and Brienne. He does a fantastic job of writing compelling characters, compelling themes, even Cersei, if you want to throw her in there as well. I just think that some of the, duller parts of this book that are not as well written, that I don't think are as good, like Samwell specifically, hold this plot line back a little bit. And I also think, the writing for characters like Arya, it's fine, but it's not like up to, the writing or the greatness of that character in other books. And so I just look at Feast for Crows, and I think it's kind of right there in the middle. I don't think it's really badly written or anything like that, and I don't think it's like the peak of George's writing either. Number 4. Now, this is where the surprise should be. As you guys know, my favorite book, or maybe you don't, maybe this, you're a new reviewer or whatever. My favorite book is A Clash of Kings. I consistently rate it as my top book in A Song of Ice and Fire. But I do acknowledge it's not the best written book in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's just not. It has some issues with how the character of Daenerys is written. At times, Bran is kind of a weird character in this book. I do think he's not bad in this book, but I don't think he's as interesting as he necessarily could be. I think that this book kind of is a better version of A Dance with Dragons in a lot of ways. I compare the last 2 books of the series kind of to some of the first 2 books of the series because they have similar writing. Like Dance with Dragons to me is very high highs but really low lows. A Clash of Kings, in my opinion, is really high highs, but then there are lows there, but they're not as low as Dance with Dragons. That's kind of how I look at it, right? Because I think Tyrion's writing, Davos's writing of the Stan, and even the Stan's character as a whole in this book, Catelyn, there's just some really great characters. Theon and his development in this book. I really like this book. I just think that it does not, because of some of the inconsistencies in writing in the book, it doesn't hit my top 3 for that reason. Now, number 3 is A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. This is the book that out of every book on here, I read this one last, which is kind of surprising given that it's, I think, the most like A Song of Ice and Fire in terms of the way it's told and the story. But I think A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is a perfect novella in terms of what it covers. And I think the only reason I have it at number 3 is because I think you look at the other 2 books that I haven't named that are A Song of Ice and Fire, or that are in A Song of Ice and Fire, are much longer. They deal with more interesting themes and conflicts, and it's a much more prolonged consistency of great to perfect writing that I think that A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, I have no problem if you put this as George's best written A Song of Ice and Fire book, because it is great. I really love what George does with this. He takes us to a character that, isn't playing the political game. He's just trying to make a living. He's trying to have a life. And him running into the Targaryen, dynasty and how he interacts with that and affects it and how that shapes the world, but then also the corruptness of this world and the interesting political intrigue. If you have the Blackfyre Targaryen conflict is largely introduced in this book. It's just a really compelling series of novellas. And so when we get that in the show, I think this is why I think a lot of people have, a lot of hopes, or even maybe not so much, because this is one of their favorite pieces of George's writing. And I do think it deserves to be at least top 4. I could see a way, you put A Clash of Kings above A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. But I think for me, I have to keep A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms at number 3. Number 2 and 1 to me are very interchangeable. I do think these are, for me, the definitive top 2. I just think you can switch them around. Number 2 I have is A Storm of Swords. Now, A Storm of Swords to me is all the payoff. And so it really depends on what writing you like of George's more. Do you like how he writes his payoffs and, crafts these beautiful moments of tension and horror or excitement or whatever, right? You think about the things that happen in Storm of Swords. The way he details, the Red Wedding, which is, in my opinion, if I was saying what is the best written chapter, it would be probably the Red Wedding for me. But it's the way that you have those things, right? The Red Wedding and all the big moments he does brilliantly. But then he also does the really small moments really well as well, right? And so you just have so much in this book that pays off things from the earlier 2. I am somebody that personally likes the journey of getting to those moments and the start of those, journeys more than I like the payoffs and the big moments of those characters. So to me, I think A Storm of Swords is one of those perfect books in my opinion. I don't have really much criticism of A Storm of Swords. I just think I prefer, it's just a personal thing for me. I prefer a Game of Thrones at number one. A Game of Thrones to me, over the last like year, maybe about 2 years, I really went thoroughly through a Game of Thrones. And I kind of fell in love with this book because this book, for my favorites anyway, has always teetered around like number 3 or like number 2. It's kind of teetered around that edge. And I think Game of Thrones, it's just a really, really well-written book. I mean, you think about how much it has to introduce to the audience about this world and how complex George's world is, and how it takes all these characters from the beginning to the end, and they all have a character arc in that book that makes sense and is fulfilled by the end of the book. It is just a really perfectly written book. It's up there as one of my favorites, even though it's not my favorite even in this, series. But I think what George was able to do and capture in this first book, and the vision that you could tell he had, the things that he was writing in the first book that end up paying off by the third book, just insane to me. I think the way that he was able to craft this beautiful story where, it starts out small and then it starts to slowly get bigger. And even when you have a character like Daenerys, I think this is Daenerys' strongest book, she feels completely interwebbed into the game of the story of a Game of Thrones and the Ned plotline and the other, the Westeros plotline, even while she's on another continent, right? I love what George was able to do with this because everything feels interweaved into this story that he's trying to tell. And, the way that it ends, it feels fulfilling for every single plotline, right? Robb becoming king, Daenerys bringing the dragons back, Ned's death, Arya having to use all her skills to survive King's Landing and eventually is going to get out with Yoren, Sansa basically starting as a character that's naive and believes in all these fairy tales and songs and all these things, and knights being good people, and by the end that's almost completely gone. And she's a hostage of war, more or less, with this cruel person that is Joffrey, where she finally realizes who he truly is. Jon's storyline of figuring out who he is as a person, and he figures that out, and he's going to be a man of the Night's Watch. He's going to go north of the wall. Bran, him trying to figure out, what is his place in the world and his relationship with, his brother Robb and all of that, and figuring out that he may be involved in some sort of magic by the end of the story, as they get the message that Ned has died, and him and Rickon have the same dream. Catelyn, for instance, right, and her journey that she goes through in the entire first book, with trying to protect her family and watching Robb grow as a person. And I really find that this book, even as a standalone book, if there was no other second, third, fourth, fifth book, whatever, feels like a complete story, right? Even though it's setting up a ton of stuff for the next book. And it's something that I think does way better than Clash of Kings, is that it tells its story and it ends with its own story without overdoing a lot of the setup for the next book. Clash of Kings sometimes can run into this part of it where it's a lot of the setup. It's a lot of the nitty-gritty that's set up for the next book, but isn't necessarily overly important for the story that it's trying to tell. And I think a Game of Thrones manages those things perfectly. So this is my rankings and my list for the best written books George R.R. Martin has put out in terms of just a writing and just straight up writing point of view, not on my personal attachment to characters and the way I actually view these books. But this is kind of my list for the best written. Let me know what you guys think. I think this is a great topic of discussion, like taking out, what your favorite book is and what you think is actually George R.R. Martin's best, written book. I think it's a fun topic to discuss. So let me know in the comments what you guys think. And I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.